Welcome back to the channel, where we dive deep into the darkest corners of the world, exploring real-life stories that will leave you questioning what you thought you knew. Tonight, we're taking you on a journey into one of the most unsettling places you could ever imagine: abandoned hospitals. These are not your typical haunted house stories. What you're about to hear are chilling accounts of real experiences, shared by those who've dared to step inside these forgotten buildings, only to find that they're not as empty as they seem. Turn off the lights, settle in, and prepare yourself for some of the most terrifying hospital encounters ever recorded. Let's get started. Abandoned hospital experience, a night I'll never forget. There's something about abandoned hospitals that carries a heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere. You don't need to believe in ghosts or the paranormal to feel the weight of years of suffering that passed through its halls. And yet, I wasn't exactly prepared for what happened to me that night. A few years ago, I used to explore abandoned places with a friend. We were into urban exploration, seeking out old buildings and trying to capture the eerie beauty of forgotten spaces. One night, we decided to check out an old hospital that had been shut down for over 2 decades. It wasn't a typical place people knew about, off the beaten path, far from the city, but still within driving distance. We had heard rumors, of course. Stories about strange noises, lights flickering at night, and even whispers of shadowy figures. But we shrugged it off. Most places we'd been to had similar stories, and we'd never seen anything we couldn't explain. We arrived late, close to midnight. The building loomed large, like a skeleton, with broken windows and crumbling walls. It was easy to imagine the kind of life that once moved through it: patients, doctors, nurses, all gone, leaving behind a shell. My friend and I set out with flashlights and cameras, eager to capture some footage. The first couple of floors were nothing remarkable, just empty rooms, peeling paint, and rusted equipment left behind. But as we climbed higher, the feeling began to change. The air got colder, despite it being the middle of summer, and the silence was heavy. There was no sound, not even the wind. It felt like we had entered a different world, one where time had stopped. We reached the 3rd floor, which, according to old records, had been used for long-term patients, those who were terminally ill. I remember feeling a chill down my spine the moment we stepped onto that floor. My friend, usually talkative, had gone quiet too. We walked down the hallway, our footsteps echoing unnervingly. There were rooms with beds still inside, some with old force-stands. It was like a snapshot of the past. About halfway down the hall, we heard it. A faint sound, like a shuffle or a dragging noise, coming from one of the rooms ahead. We stopped and listened. The sound continued for a few seconds, then stopped. My heart was pounding, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had gotten in, or it was just the building settling. My friend looked at me, clearly spooked but trying to play it cool. We decided to check it out. We approached the room where the sound had come from, shining our flashlights inside. It was empty. Completely empty. Nothing had been disturbed, no signs of anything that could have made the noise. We stood there for a moment, scanning the room, and then we both heard it again, this time, from behind us. A soft, unmistakable scraping sound, like someone was dragging something heavy along the floor. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the hall, but there was nothing. My friend whispered, "Let's get out of here," and I didn't argue. As we started walking back down the hallway, the sound followed us, staying just out of sight. It was slow, methodical, like whatever it was didn't want to catch up but didn't want to let us leave either. We quickened our pace, practically running by the time we reached the stairs. The moment we set foot on the first step, the sound stopped. Dead silence again. I paused, glancing back up the hallway, but there was nothing. My friend grabbed my arm, pulling me down the stairs. When we reached the bottom floor, we heard it one last time, a faint, distant dragging noise, like it was coming from the floors above us. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We left in a hurry, driving away without looking back. We didn't talk much on the ride home. We never really spoke about it again, actually. The footage we took? Useless. Everything from the third floor onward was corrupted, filled with static and strange glitches. It wasn't the first time we had lost footage, but this felt different. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was nothing, just a trick of the mind, the atmosphere playing with us. But the sound, that dragging noise, it still haunts me. I've been to other abandoned places since, but I've never gone back to that hospital. Something about it felt wrong, like we weren't supposed to be there, like we were intruding on something much older, much darker. Some places hold on to their past, and sometimes, the past reaches out to remind you. The Cold Ward, a night in the abandoned hospital. It's strange how certain places seem to hold on to the energy of what they once were. Hospitals, in particular, feel like they absorb the emotions of every person who ever walked through their doors: fear, pain, hope. This was exactly what I was thinking the night I found myself inside one of the oldest abandoned hospitals in the region. I had heard about the place from a friend who was into urban exploration. He mentioned that this hospital had been shut down abruptly decades ago, due to financial problems, leaving much of the equipment still inside. Unlike some of the other places we'd visited, this one had a reputation, not just for being eerie, but for the stories people told. Some claimed they heard voices, others said they'd seen shadowy figures moving down the hallways. But, of course, it's always easy to dismiss those stories as exaggerations or the product of overactive imaginations. I didn't really believe in the paranormal, but I was curious. It was a rainy evening when we arrived. The hospital was situated on the edge of a small town, far enough from any main road that it had remained relatively untouched by vandals. The building itself was imposing, 5 stories of decaying concrete and shattered windows. We parked nearby, grabbed our flashlights, and made our way in through a side door that had been broken open long ago. The first few floors were much like any other abandoned building: peeling paint, broken furniture, and an overwhelming sense of neglect. But as we moved deeper into the building, that familiar, uneasy feeling began to creep in. It wasn't fear exactly, but more of a sense that we weren't alone, like the air itself was heavier the further we went. We made it up to the 4th floor, where the surgical wards had once been. It was a long, dimly lit hallway, with rooms branching off to either side. We decided to split up, each of us taking one side of the hall to explore. My friend headed down the left, and I went to the right, stepping into one of the rooms that still had an operating table in the center. The moment I entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop. It wasn't just cooler, it was freezing, as if someone had left a window wide open in the dead of winter. I could see my breath in front of me, which made no sense. The hospital had been closed for years, with no electricity, and the weather outside wasn't cold enough to cause this. But I shook it off, thinking it might just be the way the building was deteriorating. I walked further into the room, noticing the equipment left behind. Old surgical tools, rusted and covered in dust, lay on a tray near the table. I ran my flashlight over them, feeling a strange sense of unease. And then, I heard it. A low, almost inaudible murmur, like someone whispering just out of earshot. I froze, holding my breath, listening. The whispering continued, but I couldn't make out any words. It was as if multiple voices were speaking at once, just beneath the surface of the noise. I quickly turned around, shining my light back toward the door, but there was no one there. The hall was empty. I called out to my friend, but he didn't respond. Suddenly, the whispering grew louder, as if it were right behind me. I whipped around again, but the room was still empty. My heart was racing now, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. I backed out of the room, keeping my light trained on the door, and practically ran back down the hallway. As I reached the stairwell, I found my friend waiting at the top of the stairs, looking pale. Without a word, we both descended the stairs and left the building. We didn't talk about what had happened until we were back in the car, miles away from the hospital. It turns out, my friend had heard the same thing, whispers, but from a different room. He thought I had been trying to scare him, but when he saw my reaction, he knew something was off. We didn't stick around to find out what it was, but I'll never forget that feeling of cold and those whispers, as if the hospital itself was still full of voices, long after the people were gone. I haven't gone back to that hospital, and I don't plan to. Some places are better left alone, and I think that hospital is one of them. Echoes in the asylum. I've always been skeptical when it comes to paranormal stories. I've heard them all: ghost sightings, objects moving by themselves, strange noises in the dark. But I'd never experienced anything close to that myself, at least not until I found myself inside an abandoned psychiatric hospital late one night. This place had been the subject of many urban legends, most of them centered around the treatment of patients back in the early 1900s. It wasn't hard to imagine the cruelty that went on inside those walls, and the atmosphere of the place reflected that, dark, oppressive, and heavy with the weight of its history. A friend of mine suggested we explore it, and although I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea, I figured it would make for an interesting night. We arrived around midnight. The hospital was massive, with several buildings scattered across a large, overgrown property. The main building, where most of the patients had been kept, loomed in front of us, its windows shattered and the paint peeling off in long strips. We climbed through a broken window and found ourselves in the main hallway. The smell of mildew and decay hit us immediately. The first floor was mostly administrative offices, old records and broken furniture scattered around. It was creepy, but not terrifying. As we made our way to the stairs, my friend suggested we head to the basement. The basement was where the more difficult patients were supposedly kept, according to the stories. I wasn't thrilled about that idea, but curiosity got the best of me, so we headed down. The basement was different. The air was colder, and the layout was more like a maze, with long, narrow hallways and small, windowless rooms. We walked slowly, our flashlights cutting through the thick darkness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. About halfway down the main hallway, we found a room with an old metal bed frame still bolted to the floor. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The mattress rotted away, leaving only the bare springs behind. I was inspecting the bed when I heard something that made my heart skip a beat, a faint echo of footsteps coming from further down the hall. My friend heard it too. We both stood still, listening. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was an animal, or the sound of our own footsteps echoing off the walls. But then it happened again, this time closer, like someone was walking toward us. My friend whispered, "Do you hear that?" And I nodded, my throat dry. We slowly backed out of the room and into the hallway, pointing our flashlights in the direction of the sound. The footsteps stopped, but the silence was worse. There was no wind, no dripping water, just dead air. And then, from one of the rooms behind us, came a loud bang, like something heavy had been knocked over. We didn't wait to find out what it was. We turned and sprinted back toward the stairs, not daring to look back. As we reached the bottom of the staircase, we both heard it, a deep, guttural moan, echoing through the basement like something out of a nightmare. It was unlike anything I've ever heard before or since. We ran up the stairs, burst through the door, and didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath. Once we were back in the car, my friend turned to me, his face pale. "Did you hear it?" he asked. "The moan?" I nodded, still trying to catch my breath. Neither of us could explain what happened that night. There was no one else in the building, of that, I'm certain. But the sound of those footsteps, the bang, and that horrific moan will stay with me forever. I haven't returned to that hospital, and I doubt I ever will. Whatever's down there, in the darkness of that basement, is something I never want to encounter again. And that wraps up tonight's chilling encounters from inside some of the most eerie and unsettling abandoned hospitals. These places, once full of life and activity, now stand as silent reminders of a darker past. Whether you believe in the paranormal or not, there's no denying the fear and unease that can creep up when you find yourself alone in places like these. If you enjoyed these stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. And remember, sometimes, the scariest things aren't what you see, but what you feel when no one else is around. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.